Captain Sarah Mitchell had never wanted fame or recognition. All she ever wanted was to serve, to stand on the same ground as those who believed in duty above comfort, courage above fear. She was a woman of quiet conviction, the kind who said little but noticed everything. In a world where some still doubted that a woman could command on the front lines, Sarah didn't argue. She simply performed. Her path to Afghanistan had been paved with obstacles. During her first year in training, she had faced whispers behind her back, dismissive smirks when she outshot her peers on the range, and silence when she volunteered for high-risk assignments. But Sarah never complained. Instead, she worked harder, rising before dawn, pushing her endurance past exhaustion, memorizing every tactical manual, and absorbing every lesson from combat veterans. Over time, respect came not from her gender, but from her results. Now, at 32, she was one of the most capable field officers in her division. Her calm demeanor had saved her platoon more than once. But her new assignment, Operation Iron Dusk, was different. It was supposed to be a routine patrol through a mountain valley near the Helmand border, a region notorious for insurgent movement, but quiet for months. Routine, her commander said. A simple recon. Sarah had heard that before. The dawn was cool when her unit rolled out from the forward operating base. The rising sun spilled orange light over the barren ridges, and the air carried the scent of dust and fuel. Her convoy of 4 Humvees moved in a slow column, their tires grinding over gravel as soldiers scanned the terrain. Inside the lead vehicle, Sarah checked her map again. Topography lines, dry riverbeds, and potential choke points. Every detail mattered. Private Lewis, a young recruit seated beside her, tried to break the silence. "Ma'am, think we'll be back in time for dinner?" he asked, half joking. Sarah offered a small smile. "If we do everything by the book, we will." She said it with calm confidence, but deep down, a strange unease stirred. The valley ahead seemed too still. No shepherds, no distant echoes of movement. Just wind, whispering through the rocks. She keyed her radio. "Eagle 1 to base. We're entering Sector 9. Comms are fading slightly. Static." Then a faint reply. "Copy that, Eagle 1. Proceed with caution." The signal crackled and died. For 10 more minutes, they drove in silence. The soldiers were relaxed but alert, scanning ridges for movement. Sarah's eyes shifted constantly between the map, horizon, and rearview mirror. She trusted her instincts, and right now, they screamed that something wasn't right. Then came the first hint, a flicker of light on the far ridge, like a reflection from glass. A second later, another glint. Sarah's stomach dropped. "Ambush!" she shouted. "Everyone out. Take cover." Before the last syllable left her mouth, the world exploded. An earth-shaking blast threw the lead Humvee sideways, shattering windows and swallowing the air in fire. Dirt rained from above as machine gun fire tore through the valley. The second vehicle swerved, tires shredding under impact. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting over the deafening noise. Sarah's ears rang, her lungs burned, but training took over. She dragged Lewis, dazed and bleeding, behind a rock formation and scanned the horizon. She counted muzzle flashes, traced their angles, estimated enemy positions. At least 20, maybe 30, hidden among the ridges. They had planned this perfectly. She pressed her radio. "Eagle 1 to base. We're under attack. Coordinates static." The signal was dead. Her commander, Major Bryant, was 50 meters ahead, trying to rally his team. But before she could reach him, a burst of gunfire struck near his position. She saw him fall. "Major's down!" Someone shouted. In that instant, leadership passed to her. Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted through gunfire, her boots sliding over loose gravel. Bullets tore the ground near her feet, one grazing her sleeve. She dove beside Sergeant Collins, who was pinned behind a burning truck. Collins regrouped the second squad behind that ridge. She ordered, "Private Lewis, cover fire from the left. Get the wounded behind the vehicle." Her voice was sharp, commanding, cutting through chaos. Soldiers responded instinctively. No one questioned her now. An explosion shook the ground again, an RPG striking the rear vehicle. Flames roared, black smoke curling into the sky. The heat pressed against her face. Yet Sarah stayed focused. "Use the smoke as cover." She yelled, "Move now." They repositioned fast, her strategy unfolding under fire. She created overlapping lines of defense, forcing the enemy into confusion. For every inch they lost, she made them pay with time. As bullets screamed overhead, Sarah crawled beside Lewis, who was clutching his shoulder. "You're hit?" she asked. "Just a graze, ma'am," he gasped. "I can still shoot." "Good," she said, locking eyes with him. "Then don't waste a single bullet." He nodded, determination hardening his face. Minutes felt like hours. The air filled with the metallic scent of gunpowder and blood. Sand kicked up around her as rounds struck close, but Sarah didn't flinch. She fired short, precise bursts, conserving ammo. Every movement was measured, every command deliberate. Finally, a momentary lull. Silence, except for the distant echo of gunfire retreating into the hills. She exhaled, wiping sweat and dust from her face. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but adrenaline. She surveyed the scene. 3 vehicles damaged, 4 soldiers wounded, 1 confirmed dead. And somewhere out there, the enemy was regrouping. They weren't done yet. Collins crawled beside her. "Ma'am, reinforcements?" She shook her head. "Coms are dead. Closest units 2 hours out." He cursed under his breath. "We can't hold that long." "We don't have to," she replied quietly. "We just have to hold long enough." He looked at her, confused. "Long enough for what?" Sarah's eyes hardened. "For me to turn this around." She stood, scanning the ridgeline through her scope. The enemy was moving. She could see shadows shifting, preparing for another wave. The odds were impossible, but retreat meant death. If she broke their momentum, even for a few minutes, her soldiers might survive. "Get everyone ready," she said. "We're not done fighting." As the next wave began, Sarah took a deep breath, tasting dust and fire. The world narrowed to the rhythm of her heartbeat. This was what all the years of struggle, doubt, and training had led to. This moment. Outnumbered, outgunned, under fire. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. As she leaned into her rifle and sighted the enemy leader through the scope, a strange calm washed over her. Fear was gone, replaced by something deeper, purpose. She exhaled slowly, whispered, "For them," and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley, and the battle for survival had truly begun. The echo of Sarah's rifle faded into the dust-choked air, but the silence didn't last long. The valley trembled again under the scream of enemy rounds. Her shot had dropped 1 insurgent, maybe their spotter, but dozens remained. They knew exactly where her team was pinned, and they were closing in fast. "Reload!" She barked, ducking behind the charred remains of the lead Humvee. The metal was hot enough to burn, but it made good cover. Sergeant Collins slid next to her, sweat cutting clean lines down his dust-covered face. "They're flanking us from the west ridge," he shouted over the noise. "At least a dozen moving low." Sarah wiped grit from her eyes, peering through her scope. The ridge Collins mentioned was crawling with movement, dark shapes slithering through rocks. They were trying to box her team in. A classic tactic. If they succeeded, her soldiers would be trapped like fish in a barrel. Not today, she muttered. She switched frequencies on her radio again. Static. Nothing. HQ was still out of reach. Reinforcements could be an hour, maybe more. Her unit of 12 had already taken hits. 2 were badly wounded, and 1 was gone. Time wasn't on their side. Lewis, she called out. The young private, still pale from the Gray's wound, crawled to her. Yes, ma'am. Take Spencer and Ramirez. Find elevation on that hill to the south. Keep them busy from above. If they're looking at you, they're not looking at us. He hesitated. That's almost open ground. I know, she said, locking eyes with him. But if we don't divide their fire, we're finished. Go. He swallowed hard, nodded, and took off with the others, moving low and fast. Sarah's gaze followed them until they disappeared into the smoke. She prayed silently that her order hadn't sent them to their deaths. Then came the unmistakable sound, a deep whooshing hum that made every soldier freeze. RPG, someone yelled. Sarah dove flat as an explosion rocked the dirt just meters away. Shrapnel tore through the air, slicing through packs and helmets. The blast sent a shockwave across her chest, knocking the breath from her lungs. When she lifted her head, ringing in her ears, she saw Collins dragging a wounded corporal toward cover. The corporal's leg was mangled, his eyes wide with pain. Pressure bandage, Sarah ordered. She tore off her scarf, pressing it against the wound while Collins wrapped it tight. Stay with me, Corporal. You hear me? Stay with me? The man groaned but nodded weakly. Gunfire intensified again. Every rock and vehicle became both shield and trap. The sound was deafening, constant bursts of AK fire echoing off the walls of the valley. Dust clouds rose like ghosts. Sarah leaned out and fired 3 quick shots, dropping 1 attacker, then ducked back. Her weapon was nearly empty. She checked her last full magazine, only 2 left. Across the smoke, she spotted Lewis's team firing from their new position. Their return fire was keeping pressure on the enemy flank, just as planned. Still, she could see how quickly they were burning through ammunition. Collins slammed his back against the truck beside her, breathing hard. We can't hold this much longer. Then we don't, Sarah replied. We move. Where? He demanded. We're boxed in. She pointed to a cluster of boulders near the ridge. Rough terrain, narrow gap, good visibility. There, we form a defense there and fall back by section. Cover, fire, move. I'll take point. Collins blinked. You're insane. Maybe, she said, reloading. But staying here is suicide. Without another word, she sprinted from cover, bullets chasing her boots. She dove behind a half-collapsed wall and opened fire, shouting for the others to move. They followed, leapfrogging forward in bursts, one group shooting while the other advanced. It was risky, but it worked. They reached the boulders. The new position gave them a slight advantage, higher ground, and some cover from the ridge fire. Sarah dropped beside a jagged rock, chest heaving. Her arms ached from recoil, her ears ringing from constant detonations. Lewis's voice crackled faintly over the local channel. Ma'am, they're regrouping north side, maybe 20 strong. Hold position, she ordered. We'll pin them here. She lined up her scope again, breathing slowly. Every pull of the trigger was deliberate. Each shot echoed across the valley like defiance itself. Around her, soldiers fought with the raw desperation of survival. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Smoke blurred the sky. The ground shook with every near miss. Sarah's uniform was torn, streaked with blood and dust. She barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to angles, movement, and instinct. Between bursts of gunfire, her thoughts flickered. To her family back home, to her father's old advice. Courage isn't loud, Sarah. It's steady. That steadiness was all she had now. Collins, she yelled. We're shifting to suppressing fire. Keep their heads down. Her plan was brutal, but effective. Using staggered bursts, she forced the insurgents to stay low. They couldn't coordinate their attack without lifting their rifles. And each time one did, he fell. Then, for a brief moment, the battlefield went quiet. The dust hung thick, the wind low. Collins looked over. Did we stop them? Sarah shook her head. They're repositioning. They won't stop until we're all down. Her instincts were right again. Within minutes, more fire erupted, this time from both ridges. The enemy had split into two wings, closing in. Damn it, Collins muttered. Sarah's voice was calm. Not over yet. She crawled to her pack, pulling out smoke grenades. 3 left. She yanked the pin and threw them into the open. Thick white plumes rose, blanketing their movement. Everyone, on my mark, relocate 10 meters east. Use the smoke. They dashed through the haze, bullets whizzing unseen. One soldier tripped. Sarah grabbed his vest, pulling him up before he could fall. They slid behind new cover as the smoke began to thin. Through the fog, Sarah spotted the ridge again. Something glimmered, the same reflection she'd seen before. A sniper. She steadied her rifle, heart steady, and squeezed the trigger. The reflection vanished. Collins exhaled beside her. Nice shot. Remind me to take a vacation after this, she muttered, half a grin crossing her dirt-streaked face. He laughed once, short and hoarse. If we live through this, ma'am, first round's on me. Deal, she said. But beneath her wry humor, Sarah's mind was racing. Ammo was nearly gone. Her soldiers were running on fumes, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. The only way to survive now was to turn the hunters into the hunted. She glanced at her map, then at the jagged cliff ahead. A plan was forming, risky, nearly suicidal, but the only one that could buy them time. Collins, she said, her voice steady again. Get everyone ready to move. I've got an idea. He frowned. You're not gonna like what it takes. Doesn't matter, she said, eyes locked on the ridge. We're taking the fight to them. The valley wind howled as she stood, adjusting her rifle strap, looking every bit the soldier no one had expected, calm, unbroken, and ready to do the impossible. The next phase of the battle had begun, and Captain Sarah Mitchell was about to do something that would turn the course of history. Smoke rolled across the valley like a slow-moving storm, veiling shattered vehicles and scattered soldiers. The sound of gunfire echoed from both ridges, blending with the faint cries of the wounded. The battlefield was chaos, yet in the center of it all stood Captain Sarah Mitchell, calm as stone, eyes sharp as glass. She could feel fear gnawing at the edges of her mind, but she didn't let it in. Fear was a luxury her men couldn't afford. Her heart might have raced, her hands might have trembled, but she knew what mattered most now: control. The moment she lost that, they'd all be dead. Collins, she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Status on Lewis's team? The sergeant peeked over the ridge, then ducked back as bullets chipped the rock near his head. They're still holding that southern rise, he replied. But they're pinned, maybe 4, left firing. Sarah clenched her jaw. If they fall, we lose our flank. I won't let that happen. She adjusted her helmet, scanning the battlefield with quick, practiced precision. The enemy's gunfire had rhythm, bursts from 3 distinct directions. That meant at least 3 separate fire teams, coordinating through signals. They were organized, too organized. Someone on the enemy's side knew what they were doing. She keyed her local channel. All teams, listen up. This is Mitchell. We're not retreating. We're holding this ground until backup arrives. Tighten your perimeter. Use debris and burned-out vehicles for cover. If you can't see the enemy, you're not firing. Conserve ammo. Aim to kill, not to scare. A chorus of shaky acknowledgments came back. Even through the exhaustion and fear, her tone steadied them. Sarah knew that leadership wasn't just strategy. It was emotion under pressure. When the soldiers saw her calm, they started to believe they could survive. The wind shifted, clearing some of the smoke. Sarah peered through her scope again. The attackers were advancing low, using shallow gullies and rocks as cover. They were closing in fast, maybe 50 meters out. She tapped Collins's shoulder. 2 squads. Focus suppressive fire on the center. Make them think we're desperate. Then I'll hit them from the left. He blinked. With what? We barely have enough. With their own arrogance, she interrupted. They think we're trapped. Let's make them believe it, until they walk right into our kill zone. Her confidence was quiet, but unbreakable. Collins just nodded. Copy that, ma'am. Within seconds, her plan unfolded. From behind burning vehicles, 2 soldiers unleashed heavy bursts of fire, deliberately, wild, mimicking panic. The enemy responded immediately, pressing forward, emboldened by what looked like a collapse. But Sarah was waiting. She'd already crawled 50 meters across loose shale to a narrow rise, clutching her last smoke grenade. Her boots slipped, her hands scraped against jagged rock, but she didn't stop. Every muscle screamed, yet her mind stayed locked on one thought. Her people were counting on her. When she reached the rise, she could see the enemy clearly now, faces smeared with dirt, rifles raised, moving in formation. They didn't expect anyone to be above them. Sarah pulled the pin and hurled the smoke grenade down the slope. Thick white plumes erupted instantly, blanketing the valley. The insurgents hesitated. That hesitation was all she needed. She aimed and fired, her shots echoing like thunder. 2 enemies dropped before the rest scrambled for cover. Below, Collins's men capitalized, unleashing a flanking burst that tore through their front line. The trap worked. Within minutes, the coordinated attack turned into confusion. The insurgents began shouting orders, trying to regroup, but Sarah kept firing, forcing them back behind rocks. Lewis! She barked into her radio. Push forward 10 meters. Keep their heads down. Copy, Captain, came the strained reply. From her vantage point, Sarah watched her team crawl forward, pulling the wounded and dragging ammo boxes through dust and blood. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. Her chaos. Collins appeared at her side, breathing hard, eyes wide. You just bought us time, he said. Not enough, she replied. They'll be back stronger. We need to make them believe we've got more men than we do. She rummaged through her pack, pulling out a small transmitter, a spare radio beacon. We'll fake radio chatter on open frequency. Make it sound like reinforcements are inbound. Collins blinked. You think they'll fall for that? They're listening, she said. They always are. She switched the device on, setting it to broadcast looped fragments of false comms. Eagle 2 inbound. Air support ETA 15 minutes. Holding pattern established. The effect was almost immediate. Enemy gunfire slowed, then thinned. They were hesitating, unsure if airstrikes were coming. Sarah seized the moment. Everyone regroup around the boulder line. Ammo check, she ordered. Soldiers scrambled, counting clips and refilling magazines from fallen comrades' pouches. She moved among them, helping wherever she could, a captain who fought beside her men, not behind them. Private Lewis limped toward her, face streaked with grime. "We're low, ma'am. I've got maybe 40 rounds left. Ramirez is out. Distribute evenly," she said. "We fight smart from here. Controlled bursts. Every bullet counts." Collins crouched next to her. "You're running on fumes too, Captain. You haven't stopped since the first hit." Sarah looked at him, sweat and dust making her eyes burn. "Neither have you," she said simply. "We'll rest when we're home." A faint smile tugged at his lips. Fair enough. The lull gave her a moment to think, a dangerous luxury in combat. She thought of her first command years ago, when an ambush had cost her half her team because she'd hesitated. She'd vowed never again to let indecision take lives. She glanced at the wounded lined up behind cover. Their faces were pale, silent, but their eyes watched her, trusting her completely. That trust was a weight heavier than any armor. Then, from the distance, came a new sound, the slow, echoing thud of mortar being prepared. "Down!" she shouted instinctively. Seconds later, explosions tore across the ridge, sending rocks and dust flying. The earth convulsed. One blast landed so close that Sarah felt herself lifted and slammed to the ground. Her helmet cracked against a stone, and her vision blurred. She tasted blood, but refused to stay down. Crawling forward, she checked Collins, alive but dazed. She gripped his shoulder. "Stay with me?" He nodded weakly, coughing through dust. The mortar stopped as suddenly as they started, a brief bombardment meant to disorient, not destroy. Through the haze, Sarah saw dark silhouettes advancing again. "They're testing us," she muttered. "They think we're broken." She steadied her rifle, sighted through her scope, and took aim at the lead gunner. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat sinking with the rhythm of battle. The shot landed clean. The enemy stumbled, and their line faltered. Every small victory mattered. Every second she bought was another soldier alive. "Keep firing," she called. "We hold this ridge, or we die trying." Her words weren't shouted. They were declared, calm and certain. Something in her tone reignited the fire in her troops. The scattered, exhausted group transformed into a unified defense. Their fire grew sharper, more disciplined. The sound of retreating footsteps began to echo faintly through the valley. For the first time in hours, Sarah allowed herself to breathe deeply. The enemy had withdrawn, at least for now. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, filled with the ringing in her ears and the soft moans of the injured. Collins leaned beside her, wiping blood from his temple. "They're pulling back," he said. "You did it." Sarah shook her head. "No, they'll regroup. They always do." She looked toward the setting sun, the sky now painted in smoke and orange haze. Reinforcements were still hours away, and darkness was coming fast. She knew night wouldn't bring safety. It would bring another test. But she also knew something else. The enemy had just learned her name. The valley had fallen eerily quiet, the kind of silence that followed chaos, heavy, deceptive, and thick with dust and tension. Captain Sarah Mitchell crouched behind a shattered Humvee, her rifle still hot from continuous fire. Her hands trembled slightly, though she forced herself to steady them. Around her, soldiers panted through dry throats, clutching their weapons, eyes darting for the next threat. The sun was slipping lower, throwing long shadows across the battlefield. For nearly 2 hours, they had been under relentless attack. The enemy had the advantage: numbers, positioning, and elevation. Sarah's unit had started the day with confidence. Their mission simple: a recon patrol to secure an abandoned supply route through the Kandahar highlands. But what began as a routine mission had turned into a death trap. Dozens of insurgents had encircled them, cutting off escape routes and radio communication. Now, with ammunition running low and several men wounded, Sarah knew they had minutes before the enemy regrouped for a final push. She peeked from behind cover, her sharp eyes scanning the ridges. The insurgents were repositioning, preparing for another strike. They were smart. They wouldn't rush in. They'd choke the life out of the trapped platoon, one careful move at a time. A flicker of movement caught her eye near the western ridge. A group of enemy spotters setting up mortar. "They're about to rain hell," she muttered, lowering her binoculars. "We can't sit here and wait for it." Sergeant Diaz, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, limped to her side. "Captain, we're down to 30% ammo. I've got 2 men critical, 1 barely conscious. We can't take another wave." Sarah took a deep breath, scanning again. Her mind raced, calculation, risk, intuition. Then she saw it. A jagged path leading up to a rocky outcrop on the northeast ridge. From there, she'd have a clear view of the enemy positions and could mark targets for an airstrike if she could reach it. The only problem was the open ground between her and that ridge a killing zone. She looked at Diaz. "That ridge gives us sight on their mortar teams. If I can mark it, we can call in air support." Diaz stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You'll never make it out there. They'll cut you down before you're halfway." "Maybe," she said, tightening the strap on her helmet. "But if we stay here, we die for sure." He hesitated. Then, seeing the fire in her eyes, he nodded. "We'll cover you, Captain. You just give the word." Sarah's heart thudded as she checked her gear. Laser designator, spare mags, smoke grenades, radio. She crouched low, peering through the gap between 2 destroyed vehicles. The ridge seemed impossibly far, but her decision was made. She turned to her squad, their faces weary and dirt-streaked. "I'm moving to the ridge," she announced. "I'll mark their positions and call air support. Diaz, coordinate suppressive fire. Keep them distracted." "Captain," Private Jensen called out, voice cracking. "That's suicide." She met his gaze, calm but firm. "Then it's a good day to be brave." And with that, she sprinted from cover. Instantly, bullets ripped through the air, kicking up dust and shards of rock around her. The roar of machine guns echoed through the valley. She zigzagged between burned-out vehicles, diving behind a chunk of debris as rounds sparked off metal inches from her head. Adrenaline surged, dulling pain, sharpening focus. She pulled a smoke grenade, yanked the pin, and tossed it behind her, filling the valley with a thick white cloud. "Go, go, move." Diaz's voice shouted over the comms, and her unit unleashed a storm of suppressive fire, distracting the enemy. Sarah crawled, rolled, and sprinted again, lungs burning, uniform ripped and caked with mud. A bullet grazed her shoulder, tearing through fabric, hot pain flashing through her arm. She gritted her teeth and kept moving. Each step forward felt like defying death itself. Reaching the base of the ridge, she pressed her back against the rock, panting hard. Her vision blurred momentarily, but she forced herself to focus. One more push. The slope was steep, scattered with loose stones that threatened to betray every movement. She climbed, gripping jagged edges with blood-slicked hands. Halfway up, a shot cracked, splintering the rock beside her. Another whizzed past her ear. She ducked, heart pounding. "They've spotted me," she whispered into her headset. "Hang on, Captain," Diaz's voice came back, strained. "We're keeping them busy." "You're almost there." "Almost." The word echoed in her head as she pulled herself over the last ledge. Finally, she reached the top, a narrow plateau overlooking the entire valley. The enemy positions stretched below like ants scattered across sand. She could see their heavy machine guns, mortar teams, and even reinforcements moving in from the east. Her hands shook as she unpacked the laser designator. The sun was dipping lower, shadows deepening, Visibility was slipping fast. She aligned the sight, adjusting for distance and wind. Sweat rolled into her eyes. "Command, this is Falcon 2, she said into her radio. "Requesting immediate air support at grid coordinates Delta Tango 59er. Marking target now." Static hissed, then a faint voice replied, "Copy, Falcon 2, air support inbound. It is 7 minutes. Hold your position." Hold. That was the hardest part. Down below, the insurgents noticed her movement. A dozen rifles turned toward the ridge. She dropped flat as bullets tore into the rock around her. Dust filled her mouth. She exhaled sharply, re-aimed, and locked the laser on their mortar position. The green dot wavered, then steadied as her breathing slowed. "Mark confirmed," she whispered, pressing the trigger. Seconds later, the distant hum of jets grew louder, an unmistakable sound of salvation. She clung to the rock, bracing as the first missile screamed down. The explosion was deafening. A pillar of fire erupted from the ridge opposite hers, sending shockwaves through the valley. Another blast followed, and another. The mountains trembled as the airstrikes tore through enemy lines. The once overwhelming insurgent force scattered, some fleeing, others consumed in the storm. Sarah watched through her scope as the chaos unfolded, the mortar teams obliterated, the flanking units in disarray. She'd done it. But victory had its price. The ridge beneath her shook violently, and a chunk of rock gave way. She tumbled, sliding down the slope, hitting the ground hard. Pain exploded in her ribs, knocking the wind from her lungs. For a few seconds, the world spun in disoriented silence. Then Diaz's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Captain, you good? Talk to me." She groaned, coughing. "Still here," she rasped. "Still breathing." As the smoke cleared, her unit emerged from cover, cautiously advancing. The sound of enemy gunfire had all but faded. Sarah pushed herself to her knees, every muscle screaming in protest. She watched as her soldiers regrouped, pulling the wounded to safety, the exhaustion on their faces replaced by disbelief and hope. Diaz approached, his uniform scorched, face smeared with dirt. He looked at the sky, then back at her. "You actually did it," he said, shaking his head. "You turned the damn tide." Sarah managed a weak smile. "We did it," she corrected. Above them, the last echoes of the airstrike faded into the distant mountains. The valley, once alive with the chaos of war, now lay quiet. The smoke curled lazily toward the fading sun, painting the sky crimson. For the first time since the ambush began, Sarah allowed herself to breathe deeply. She looked over the battlefield, at the cost, the loss, and the hard-won survival. The enemy had been driven back, but her heart was heavy. So many lives had balanced on the edge of a single choice. As night began to fall, she leaned against a rock, exhausted but unbroken. Her laser designator hung at her side, the small device that had changed everything. The battle wasn't over yet. More challenges waited ahead, but in that moment, she had proven what no one expected. Against all odds, Captain Sarah Mitchell had turned the battle around. The valley still smoldered from the airstrikes. Charred earth and broken weapons littered the ground like scattered ghosts of war. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood amid the haze, her uniform torn, her face streaked with sweat and grime. Around her, soldiers tended to the wounded, whispering in disbelief that they were still alive. The air was thick with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the faint crackle of fires burning out. For the first time in hours, silence reclaimed the battlefield, a deceptive, fragile calm. Sarah crouched beside Sergeant Diaz, who was helping a medic bandage a soldier's leg. "Status?" she asked, voice low but steady. Diaz glanced up. "We lost 6. 4 critical, but stable." Ammo's almost dry. The airstrike gave us a breather, but his eyes flicked toward the eastern ridge. They'll come again. You know they will. Sarah nodded grimly. Yeah, they won't let us walk away that easily. She scanned the horizon through her binoculars. Smoke still curled into the sky, but beyond it, movement stirred. Distant figures reorganizing, small clusters darting between rocks. The enemy wasn't gone. They were regrouping. Reinforcements were arriving. The attack wasn't over. It was only changing shape. She clenched her jaw. The nearest extraction point was still miles away, and their radio link to command remained weak. The reinforcements they'd been promised hadn't yet arrived. If the insurgents regrouped for another strike, the already wounded platoon would be slaughtered. Diaz followed her gaze. They're coming, aren't they? Yeah, she said quietly. And we're not ready for it. Sarah rose, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. The air was growing colder with the setting sun, but heat still radiated from burning vehicles. She took a deep breath and walked toward the edge of the ridge, trying to think like the enemy. They would attack from the east this time, where cover was better and their numbers stronger. Her unit had one chance, to hold long enough for backup to arrive. Diaz, she called, get the remaining men in position along that ridgeline. Use what cover's left. Set up a crossfire. He hesitated. What about you, Captain? I'll take the flank. He frowned. Alone? Sarah met his eyes, her face hard but resolute. Someone needs to cover our weak side. If they breach that ridge, they'll overrun us in minutes. Then let me. She cut him off. No, you're my second. They'll need you when this is over. He looked like he wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He nodded reluctantly and started shouting orders to the men. Sarah checked her ammo. 2 full mags, 1 half spent. Not much. She reloaded, tightened her grip on her rifle, and made her way down the ridge toward the eastern slope. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of distant movement. Footsteps, the clatter of weapons, the low hum of voices. Sarah crouched behind a fallen tree trunk, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The enemy was coming. For several tense minutes, nothing moved. Then she saw them, shadows flickering between rocks, silent and coordinated. At least 20 fighters, maybe more, moving like a pack of wolves. They thought the Americans were broken. They thought the fight was over. Not today, she muttered. She waited until they were halfway up the slope before opening fire. Her first burst dropped the lead men instantly. The others scattered for cover, shouting in confusion. She shifted position, firing again from a new angle. To them, it must have seemed like multiple shooters, but it was just her, moving fast, calculating every shot. The enemy returned fire, bullets thudding into the dirt inches from her head. She rolled behind a rock, reloaded, and lobbed a grenade down the slope. It exploded with a deafening roar, echoing off the mountains. Shrapnel flew. Cries of pain followed. From the ridge above, Diaz's voice came through the combs. Captain, what's your position? East flank, halfway down the slope, she replied, ducking as another burst of gunfire ripped through the air. They're trying to flank us. I'm holding them off. Reinforcements still en route, he said. Hold tight, Captain. Hold tight. The words repeated in her head like a dare. She gritted her teeth, crawling to a new vantage point. Her shoulder burned where the earlier bullet had grazed her, but she pushed through it. Pain didn't matter. Fear didn't matter. Only time did. A figure appeared above her, rifle raised. She swung her weapon up and fired first, the man collapsing before he could pull the trigger. Another came at her from the left, too close for a rifle. She dropped it, grabbed her sidearm, and fired point blank. The recoil jolted through her arm, but she didn't stop moving. More gunfire erupted from the ridge, Diaz's men returning fire, trying to draw attention away from her position. The battle reignited in full force. For what felt like an eternity, the night became a storm of sound. Gunfire, shouts, explosions. Sarah fought with relentless precision, using every inch of terrain to her advantage. She ducked, rolled, reloaded, fired. Each shot was deliberate, each movement measured. But the enemy kept coming. They surged up the slope in waves, relentless and angry. Sarah's ammo count dropped fast. 2 mags left. 1. Half. She switched to burst fire, conserving rounds. Her breathing came ragged now, vision tunneling from exhaustion. Her hands ached from recoil. She felt the ground tremble beneath her boots as another explosion shook the ridge. Then, silence again. For a moment, she thought it was over. Then she heard movement behind her. She spun around, too late. A figure lunged from the shadows, slamming into her, knocking her weapon away. They rolled in the dirt, struggling for control. The man was strong, fueled by rage and adrenaline. Sarah's head hit the ground, stars flashing across her vision. He reached for his knife. Instinct took over. She grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, and slammed her elbow into his face. The knife clattered away. With a fierce yell, she drove her knee into his chest, forcing him back, then reached for the fallen rifle and fired once. The shot echoed in the stillness. The man went limp. Sarah sat there for a second, gasping for breath, every muscle trembling. Then she heard it, the low rumble of helicopters in the distance. Reinforcements. Finally, she staggered to her feet, wiping blood and dirt from her face. Smoke rose from the valley, illuminated by the searchlights of incoming aircraft. The enemy, realizing they were outmatched, began retreating into the darkness. Diaz's voice crackled in her headset again. "Captain, are you still with us?" "Still here," she said, exhaling. "East flank secured. They're pulling back." "Copy that." Reinforcements touching down in 5. Sarah allowed herself a weak smile. She leaned against a rock, watching the helicopters descend in a whirlwind of dust and light. Soldiers poured out, securing the area, tending to the wounded. The battle was finally over. When Diaz reached her, his face was a mix of awe and exhaustion. "You held that flank alone?" She shrugged, too tired to speak. He just shook his head. "You're insane, Captain." "But damn, you're good." Sarah gave a tired laugh. "Remind me never to do that again?" As dawn broke over the shattered valley, the first rays of sunlight touched the American flag patch on her shoulder. It glimmered faintly through the dirt and blood. She looked around, at the surviving men, the destroyed landscape, the price of victory, and felt both pride and sorrow. She had fought not just for survival, but for the people behind her. And in that brutal night, when everything seemed lost, one woman's will had held an entire line together. The battle was over, but her war, inside her heart and memory, had only begun. The sun crept slowly over the torn valley, bleeding gold through the drifting haze of smoke and dust. The world that had been chaos only hours earlier was now eerily still. Spent casings glimmered faintly in the morning light. Broken helmets, scorched vehicles, and abandoned rifles told the story of a night that had tested the limits of every soul who had survived it. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked among the wreckage in silence, her boots crunching softly over debris. The acrid stench of gunpowder and burned fuel hung heavy in the air. Her uniform was torn, streaked with dirt and blood, some of it her own, most of it not. She had slept barely 10 minutes since the firefight ended, yet her mind refused rest. Her body moved on instinct alone, checking, counting, reassuring. Everywhere she looked, medics were working. They moved with quiet urgency, voices low but controlled, as helicopters landed and lifted off again with the wounded. The rhythmic thump of the rotors was the only steady sound in the aftermath of chaos. Sergeant Diaz approached from behind her, a bandage around his forearm, his eyes shadowed but alert. "Command's been notified," he said, voice hoarse. "They're calling this a full-scale engagement now. Reinforcements are securing the perimeter." Sarah nodded, her gaze sweeping the field. "And our men?" He hesitated. 12 dead, 21 wounded, 4 critical. Her jaw tightened. Numbers. Just numbers on paper to higher command. But each number was a face she knew, a voice she remembered, a laugh she could still hear echoing through the barracks. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay composed. "Captain," Diaz said softly, "you saved the rest of us. Without you, none of us would be standing here." She shook her head. "We saved each other. No one fights alone out here." She turned away before he could say more. Words meant little right now. There were things to do, soldiers to account for, reports to file, lives to honor. She walked toward a cluster of medics where a makeshift triage area had been set up. A young private lay there, face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. His leg was wrapped tight, blood still seeping through the gauze. He looked up as she knelt beside him. "Captain, we made it, didn't we?" She managed a small smile. "Yeah, soldier, we made it." And then, his eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion overtaking him. She squeezed his hand gently before standing. Around her, every face she saw carried that same mixture of pain and disbelief, survivor's eyes. As the hours passed, the field transformed into an organized grid of recovery. Engineers moved in to clear wreckage, communications teams restored signal, and intelligence officers began collecting whatever enemy equipment had survived the airstrikes. But Sarah stayed apart from the noise, walking alone along the ridge where it had all started. The ground here still bore the scars of the battle, deep gouges where mortar had struck, blackened patches where vehicles had burned. She stopped near a small outcropping where the body of Lieutenant Harrington, her commanding officer, had been found. He had died early in the assault, cut down before he could issue a single counter command. Sarah knelt, brushing a bit of dust from the insignia on his helmet. The memory hit her sharply. His laugh during the morning briefing, his last words before the ambush. Routine patrol, easy day. She swallowed hard, the weight in her chest pressing heavier than any physical wound. "Sir," she whispered, voice barely audible, "we held the line. You'd have been proud of them." For a moment, she stayed there, still, silent, just breathing. The war never gave time for mourning, but this was all she could offer. A quiet promise amid the ashes. Behind her, footsteps approached again. It was Diaz, carrying a small metal case. "Captain, Evac Command wants you to transmit a debrief as soon as possible," he said. "They're ready to pull us out in 2 hours." Sarah nodded slowly, standing up. "Make sure all wounded are prioritized. No one gets left behind." "Already handled," Diaz said. Then, after a pause, he added, "You should get checked out too. You're bleeding again." She looked down. Her left sleeve was soaked through at the shoulder, where the earlier bullet had grazed her. She hadn't noticed. She'd grown numb to the pain, both physical and otherwise. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. "Later." He sighed. "You always say that." Sarah offered a faint, tired smile. "Because it's always true." They started walking back toward the camp together. The rising sun glinted off distant metal, and for a fleeting second, the valley almost looked peaceful, as though the earth itself didn't remember the fire and fury that had consumed it just hours before. By midday, the surviving unit gathered near the evacuation point. Supply crates and stretchers lined the area. The soldiers stood in formation, ragged, dirty, but unbroken. Sarah faced them, her helmet tucked under her arm. The wind caught strands of her hair, carrying dust across her face. She looked at each of them, some leaning on crutches, some staring blankly into space, others standing tall despite exhaustion. "You fought like warriors," she began, voice carrying over the quiet. "We were outnumbered, outgunned, but not one of you gave up. You held your ground when every instinct said to run. That's not something metals can measure. That's something inside, something no one can ever take from you." Her words settled over them like the calm after a storm. A few nodded. Others just stood still, letting it sink in. As the medevac helicopters began to arrive, Sarah stepped aside, watching her soldiers board one by one. The sight filled her with pride and a quiet sorrow that she couldn't shake. She had done her job, but leadership always came with a cost. When the last chopper lifted off, Diaz handed her a folded flag, one of the ones they'd recovered from a fallen soldier's pack. "He wanted you to have it," Diaz said quietly. "Said you reminded him of home." Sarah stared at the flag for a long time, her throat tightening. "No," she said finally, pressing it back into his hands. "Make sure it gets to his family. That's where it belongs." He nodded, tucking it into his vest. "Understood." As the wind from the departing helicopters whipped through the valley, Sarah turned one last time to look at the battlefield below. The scorched terrain stretched endlessly, silent, vast, and hauntingly beautiful in its own broken way. In that moment, she realized how thin the line between life and death truly was. A single decision, a single heartbeat, and everything changed. Diaz's voice broke her thoughts. "Captain, you coming?" She took a long breath, eyes still on the horizon. "Yeah," she said softly. "Let's go home." As the helicopter lifted her into the sky, the battlefield grew smaller beneath her, just another mark on the endless map of war. She closed her eyes, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath her boots. The men around her were silent, lost in their own thoughts. Sarah leaned back against the seat, exhaustion finally pulling at her. But even as her body demanded rest, her mind replayed every sound, every face, every choice she had made that night. And somewhere in that mix of pain and pride, she felt the faintest flicker of peace. They had survived. But she knew, deep down, that survival was only the beginning. The world outside the valley was quiet in comparison to the chaos Sarah had just left behind, but that quiet was deceptive. News of the ambush and the miraculous defense had spread quickly through military channels, and, soon after, into the public eye. Her name, Captain Sarah Mitchell, became a symbol of courage and tenacity. Soldiers, journalists, and civilians alike wanted to know the story of the woman who had held a line against overwhelming odds. Sarah sat alone in a small briefing room at the base, the fluorescent lights harsh on her tired eyes. A stack of reports, commendations, and official communications sat in front of her. A military officer, a colonel with sharp lines on his face, stood nearby. "Captain," he began, voice formal but tinged with admiration, "your actions in the valley were exemplary. We are preparing to recommend you for multiple decorations, including the Silver Star." She blinked, unprepared for the sudden weight of recognition. "Sir, it wasn't just me," she said quietly. "My men, we did what we had to do to survive." He nodded, though his eyes betrayed understanding. "Of course. But your leadership, your decisions saved lives. That cannot go unnoticed." Sarah exhaled slowly, staring down at the reports. The words on the page felt strange. Praise, heroism, bravery. She didn't feel any of those things. She felt the exhaustion in her bones, the phantom pain in her shoulder, and the faces of the men who hadn't made it home. Later, she would read every article written about her, every interview quoting her actions. Headlines like, "Woman single-handedly turns the battle around," or "Captain Mitchell defies the odds," filled the news. Social media exploded with admiration. Yet, every time she saw a picture of herself, dirt-streaked and bloodied, she saw the valley, the smoke, the gunfire, the young faces staring at her for guidance. Heroism, she realized, was an uncomfortable word for what had been a matter of survival. Despite the recognition, the weight of responsibility pressed on her. That night in the valley replayed endlessly in her mind. The soldiers she had led, the ones who survived, the ones who didn't, haunted her thoughts. She remembered Private Lewis's pale face as he scrambled under fire, Sergeant Collins shouting orders, and the quiet bravery of those who had stayed alive only because she had acted first. The Silver Star ceremony was held days later. Sarah stood at attention, uniform pressed, medals gleaming. The hall was packed with officers, family members, and press. Cameras flashed. People clapped. Everyone seemed to see the unshakable hero she was supposed to be. But inside, she wrestled with a private storm. Colonel Thompson pinned the Silver Star to her chest. For conspicuous gallantry, exceptional leadership, and unwavering bravery under fire, he intoned. Applause filled the room, echoing off the walls. She smiled politely, nodding. The public saw courage and control. She felt only the burden of choices and lives lost. Each medal, each handshake, reminded her that she had survived and others hadn't. After the ceremony, she retreated to her quarters. The room was small and quiet. She sank into the chair by the window, looking out at the base below. She thought of the valley, not as a battleground, but as a mosaic of memories. Flashes of fire, cries of fear, the smell of dust and gunpowder. Her hands shook slightly as she rubbed the metal against her chest. Her phone buzzed with messages from journalists requesting interviews, old friends congratulating her, and strangers praising her actions. She ignored most of them, letting the silence of the room settle around her. The outside world was full of noise, full of stories that wanted to glorify her. But in her heart, she still walked that valley, still crawled through the smoke, still felt the weight of every life she couldn't save. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sergeant Diaz stepped in, a tired grin on his face. "They're asking for another statement, Captain. Are you ready?" She shook her head. "Not yet." He nodded, understanding. "It's hard, isn't it? All this attention?" "It's not attention I want," she admitted quietly. "It's closure. And I don't have it yet. The valley, it's still there. In me." Diaz sat across from her. "You did everything you could. You saved the men who survived. That counts. I wish it felt like enough," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about those we lost. I keep replaying their faces. The whole time, I felt like one wrong move would have been the end for all of us." Diaz reached out, resting a hand on hers. "That's leadership. The weight of command is never light. But you acted. You made the hard calls. And because of you, more lives were saved than lost. You can't carry the losses alone." She nodded slowly, but the ache in her chest didn't ease. Night fell outside the window, shadows stretching across the room. She leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the weight of the day and the last week press against her. The next morning, she was expected to give interviews. Cameras, microphones, and reporters crowded around her as she stepped outside the base command center. Questions came rapidly. How did you manage to hold the line? What went through your mind during the firefight? Do you feel like a hero? Sarah paused, thinking carefully before answering. "I don't know if anyone here feels like a hero," she said slowly. "We did what we had to do to survive. Courage isn't in a medal or a headline. It's in the people who stay alive, who look out for each other when everything is against them. I was just doing my job. My men are the true heroes." The reporters scribbled furiously. This statement was honest, but it didn't capture the depth of what she felt. The guilt, the grief, the private terror that had accompanied her every decision in the valley. After the interviews, she returned to her quarters alone. She took out a notebook, something she had started during the mission. Pages were filled with observations, coordinates, and notes on enemy movement. But now, she wrote differently. She wrote about the men she had led, their bravery, and the moments that haunted her. Writing, she realized, was the only way she could make sense of what had happened. Her pen paused over the paper as she thought of Lieutenant Harrington, the young private with the broken leg, and every soldier who had trusted her with their lives. The valley was no longer just a place. It was a living memory, etched into her mind and her heart. That night, she stood at the edge of the base, looking at the stars. They were distant, cold, and steady, unlike the chaos of the past days. Yet there was a strange comfort in their constancy. For all the noise, the headlines, and the attention, the stars reminded her that some things were bigger than recognition. Courage, sacrifice, survival. These weren't things that could be measured or praised. They simply existed in the quiet moments between life and death. Sarah clenched her fists lightly, feeling both the weight and the pride of leadership. She had survived, yes, and the world called her a hero. But she knew that heroism came at a cost that would never leave her. The memories, the decisions, and the lives she carried with her would shape her forever. As the night deepened, she whispered quietly to herself, almost as a promise, "I will carry them all, every one of you, and I will keep moving forward for the ones who cannot." In that solemn moment, Sarah Mitchell understood that true courage wasn't about recognition, medals, or headlines. It was about enduring the burden of survival, carrying the weight of those who had fallen, and using that weight to guide those who remained. The world outside would see a hero. But Sarah knew the truth. Courage lived in the choices made in the dark, the fear faced alone, and the lives saved against impossible odds. And she would carry that truth, quietly, faithfully, and without compromise for the rest of her life. Months had passed since that fateful night in the valley, but for Captain Sarah Mitchell, the memories remained vivid, etched into her very being. She returned to base after the initial debriefs, interviews, and ceremonies, only to find that the public had long moved on to other headlines. Yet, for her, the battle never truly ended. Every morning brought the echo of gunfire. Every quiet moment reminded her of the faces of the men she couldn't save, and every decision she had made haunted her dreams. Sarah had resumed her duties, but something had shifted. Leadership was no longer just about orders or tactical decisions. It was about the lives intertwined with hers, about responsibility that weighed heavier than any medal or commendation. Each soldier under her command trusted her not just to lead, but to survive alongside them, to think faster, act smarter, and sometimes to sacrifice herself for their safety. That night in the valley had proven her capacity for both brilliance and fearlessness, but also revealed the emotional cost that came with it. In the quiet of her quarters, she often took out her notebook, now filled not just with battlefield observations, but with reflections on courage, loss, and human endurance. She wrote about Private Lewis and Sergeant Collins, about Lieutenant Harrington, about every man and woman who had stared into the abyss and chosen to fight. These weren't just records of events. They were memorials, personal tributes she could never voice publicly without feeling the weight of her own survival pressing down on her. One evening, As she looked out over the base from the observation deck, Diaz approached. He didn't need to speak. She knew what he would say. "They want to feature you in another article." He finally broke the silence, tone gentle. Sarah shook her head. "No, let them write what they will. I don't need the attention." Diaz nodded. "I understand. But don't think for a second that what you did doesn't inspire people. Not just civilians, but the troops out here too. They talk about your actions. They study them. You changed the game for every unit that follows." She smiled faintly, but it was tinged with sadness. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because someone had to. Because hesitation meant death. Because fear isn't an option when everyone relies on you." "Exactly," he said, quietly affirming what she already knew. The weight of leadership had transformed her. In the months following the battle, she trained new recruits, passing on lessons learned, not just tactical skills, but mental. Endurance, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of trust. Her presence became a symbol of survival, strategy, and quiet courage. Young soldiers watched her with a mixture of awe and reverence, learning from her calm determination under fire. They didn't see the internal struggles, the nights spent, reliving the battlefield, the endless questioning of every choice she had made. They only saw results, yet Sarah knew better. She remembered every shouted order, every missed breath, every life lost. The medals and the headlines could never capture the complexity of those moments. The story wasn't of glory. It was of fear, transformed into action, of exhaustion turned into vigilance, of one person's will bending the course of fate for dozens of others. Her reflection on these events deepened during an unexpected visit from the families of the fallen soldiers. She met them quietly, listening to their stories, their grief, and their gratitude. Each interaction was a delicate balance, acknowledging their loss without offering false consolation, honoring the sacrifice of their loved ones, while bearing the burden of her own survival. One mother, tearful yet composed, took her hand. "He would have wanted you to live," she said softly. "You saved so many." "Thank you," Sarah swallowed, voice catching. I just did what I had to do. Every one of them trusted me to lead them. I couldn't let that trust break. I couldn't let them down." They shared a long silence, heavy with understanding and sorrow. In that moment, Sarah felt a fragile peace, a connection between life and death, between duty and consequence. The human cost was real, but the courage of those who survived and those who sacrificed formed a living legacy she vowed to carry forward. Months turned into years, and Sarah's story became part of military lore. Her tactical decisions were analyzed, her strategies taught in classrooms, her bravery used as a benchmark for leadership under fire. Yet she remained humble, grounded in the reality that her heroism was not a solitary achievement. It was intertwined with every life she had protected and every action she had commanded. Even outside the military, her story inspired others. She visited schools and community centers, speaking quietly about perseverance, courage, and responsibility. She emphasized that heroism was not about accolades or medals, but about facing fear with clarity and helping others when they needed most. People listened, captivated not just by her story, but by the humility with which she shared it. One evening, after a day of speaking engagements, she returned to her quarters, tired yet contemplative. She looked at the collection of letters she had received, notes from soldiers she had trained, civilians inspired by her story, and letters from families of the fallen expressing gratitude. She read each one carefully, folding them back into their envelopes. Each message reminded her that the impact of courage extended far beyond the battlefield. Sarah walked to the window, gazing at the sunset. The horizon was painted with golds and reds, the colors reminiscent of the sky over the valley that had tested every limit of her endurance. She allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the years of stress, trauma, and responsibility settle into a quiet ache. She thought of her soldiers, of the choices she had made, of the lives she had touched, and the lives that had ended too soon. Her reflection was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Diaz, ever loyal, stood quietly. "You okay, Captain?" She nodded slowly. "I think so. I've learned something important over these months. Courage isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It isn't always recognized. But it leaves a mark on those who survive, on those who remember, on the world in ways we can't always see." Diaz smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And your mark will never be forgotten." Sarah allowed herself a small, serene smile. The battles would continue, both on and off the field, but she had learned to carry them with dignity, with awareness, and with quiet strength. Her legacy was no longer just the medals or the news. Articles. It was the lives saved, the lessons passed on, and the enduring courage she inspired in others. In the months and years that followed, Sarah continued her military career, never seeking recognition, never claiming heroism. She trained soldiers, advised tacticians, and spoke of courage as a principle, not a title. Every action, every decision, reflected the lessons she had learned in the valley, that fear could be transformed into action, chaos into order, and individual will into collective survival. But in the quiet moments, staring at the stars, writing in her notebook, or watching soldiers she had trained move confidently through exercises, she remembered the valley. She remembered the fear, the gunfire, the smoke, the faces of the men who had trusted her life in her hands. And she remembered that one person, standing firm against impossible odds, could indeed change the course of history. Captain Sarah Mitchell's story became more than just a tale of survival. It became a testament to leadership, courage, and resilience. Proof that heroism is measured not by medals or fame, but by the quiet, relentless commitment to others, and by the ability to endure, reflect, and inspire long after the battle is over. And in that legacy, Sarah found the peace she had long sought, not in recognition, not in headlines, but in knowing that the courage she had shown and the lives she had saved would ripple forward, shaping countless others in ways she would never fully see. The world may have called her a hero. She understood that the true heroism lay in the endurance of humanity, in the willingness to act when all seemed lost, and in the strength to carry both victory and grief forward with quiet dignity. And as she stood there, gazing at the stars that had witnessed so much, she whispered into the night, a promise to herself and to those she had lost. "I will carry you all. I will never forget, and I will continue always for as long as I can."